Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We have some new news out of the ACC. Clemson has filed their own lawsuit, joining Florida State in that movement against the ACC. Then we're going to get into some spring questions. Spring football starting all over the country. Want to get you guys updated on all the things to watch as it kind of unfolds. Then we're going to get back to some of the best games in 2024. We break down week 0 through 4 up to this point. So if you want to check out those segments, definitely do that. They're on the YouTube page. But we're going to get to 5 and 6 today, and they are just incredible weeks with tons of marquee matchups. Then we're going to finish off the show with another Spotlight Wednesday, and today we are going to talk about the Utah Utes, a ton riding on this season as they roll into the Big 12. Some playoff aspirations for this team, but it all rides on one very, very big factor, which I will get into. But before we start, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to see your questions on the screen and we can have a fun back and forth, or I can answer something that you're wondering about a certain topic, the best way to do that is to get your questions on the screen using the link on the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to see your name, your question on the screen, and maybe I can answer it and we can have a fun back and forth here. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. All right, let's jump right in because it has been an eventful 24 hours. The ACC has kind of been fighting this battle with Florida State for a couple months now, and it felt like everything was starting to kind of come to a head, right? We've been talking about it in previous weeks where Florida State feels like they're starting to kind of pick up momentum. They feel like they kind of have the ACC on the ropes, if you will, and Clemson seems to think so as well because they have joined Florida State. They have sued the ACC regarding their grant of rights, mainly regarding the withdrawal rules and the enforceability of those rules, and the just ridiculous sum that they would have to pay to leave the conference, which we will get to here in a second. But Clemson's main argument in this lawsuit is that the ACC is preventing the university from pursuing a wide range of strategic alternatives that may be necessary for its continued success in the college athletics and as an institution. So essentially, the ACC, they feel, is kind of holding them back from being able to explore all the options, whether that's the SEC or the Big Ten or any other conference. Essentially, they're just saying that their contract they have with the ACC, their grant of rights, is just too restrictive, and they should be able to essentially come and go as they please the way it is in some other conferences. So, as I talked about earlier, the big gripe here is just how much they would have to pay out of pocket to the ACC to actually leave the conference. And they have a real good leg to stand on here because when you look at the rest of the conferences, the Big Ten has no withdrawal fee at all. So you can leave for absolutely for free. The Big 12 essentially is just you do not get the revenue split for the final 2 years of your time in the Big 12. So Texas and Oklahoma just went through this. They essentially just have to forfeit that amount of money for the final 2 years if they want to leave the conference. And then the SEC is $30 million for if you give a 2-year notice before leaving the conference, $40 million for less than 2 years, and then $45 million for no notice. And the ACC is right between 130 and 140. I've seen different reports with that number. I think 130 is the number for Florida State, but I've seen 140 thrown out there for Clemson. So obviously there's a huge disparity in those numbers. And I will say, to be totally fair to the ACC, the Big 12 and the SEC have more power to allow for those rules to be a little bit more lenient in that way because not a lot of people are trying to leave the Big Ten and the SEC, let's be honest. So the Big Ten can let them leave for free. They can do that no problem because the Big Ten's not really worried about any of their guys up and leaving in the next couple of years unless they ask them to. So I don't think they're too worried about that. The same thing with the SEC. So these guys can charge a little bit less, but also the number for the ACC is exorbitant. It's a little bit ridiculous. It's kind of insane. And I think one of the big reasons for it is the ACC in 2016 signed this media deal with ESPN, and on face value, it's a good idea to keep your media deals up to date, to keep your media deals moving with the times. The ACC gave themselves pretty much no chance to do that because their media deal ran for 20 years, so it runs through 2036. So there's not really an ability to catch up with the money that the SEC or the Big Ten is making, because you set yourself in this set agreement for how much you're going to be making year over year for the next 20 years. So you don't necessarily have the ability to adjust with the times, to keep up with everyone else, because you've locked yourself in. So funnily enough, a thing that should have probably helped the ACC stay, stable for the next 20 years and be a cohesive unit has probably signed their death note, honestly. I think this is something that all of the schools across the ACC are not happy about. I think it's something that a lot of schools are starting to take more and more notice of and realize it's ridiculous that all of these other schools are signing new media deals every 5 or 7 years for just crazy payouts, where in the Big Ten it's $100 million per school, in the SEC it's $60 million, in the ACC it's somewhere around, I think, 35 to 40. I could be slightly off on that number, but just in general, that $40 million is pretty much stagnant. There could be some type of adjustment throughout the time, but it's not going to adjust the same way that media has adjusted to sports, because as we know, it's changed insane amounts. Even in the the past decade, it's been insane amounts of media money being pumped into the sport, being pumped into pretty much every single sport, and ad deals and everything like that. So it was pretty much impossible for them to keep up if they were to sign themselves into a 20-year deal, and that's exactly what they did. So a little bit of a mess created by the ACC that is now turning its ugly head, because Florida State is already in a lawsuit with the ACC. There's actually 2 lawsuits, Florida State against the ACC, that is being tried in Florida, the ACC against Florida State because they countersued in North Carolina, and now we've added Clemson suing the ACC in South Carolina. So 3 different suits for the ACC to deal with, 2 different big-time names in their conference, because I think, as we've talked about in the playoff discussions, there was a little bit of an edge above the ACC compared to the Big 12 when you talk about revenue distribution. So they got about, I think, 17%, while the Big 12 got around 15, maybe a little bit below 15%. So a big reason for that is Florida State and Clemson. Let's be honest. Those are the 2 big-time brands that are kind of pulling the ACC along. Miami does a huge part in that, North Carolina as well. But those 2 schools, Florida State and Clemson, the 2 schools that you are now fighting with, are a big reason that you are as viable of a conference as you are. So there does become a little bit of an issue. If you let these guys walk and you take down the grant of rights and you allow them to either walk for free or a much discounted rate, as Clemson obviously wants and Florida State as well, I think you could open the floodgates, right? There's a ability for a ton of different schools across that conference to buy out if you give them that opportunity, right? So that $140 million or $130 million, that insane number that they're, demanding from these schools to do, it creates a little bit more of an incentive for the smaller schools to stay around, or at the very least to stay out of these court cases, because it is not necessarily worth their time, worth their financial budget, as long as Florida State and Clemson are on the front lines, as long as the big guys are taking care of that. If the things fall the team's way, then other people will follow, and I think that's something that's going to happen here pretty shortly. Miami and North Carolina have been kind of lurking on the outside of all of this. They've been sitting, just kind of waiting to hear more news, what's going on with everything, and slowly more stuff has come out. I think it was mostly just them hedging on the idea, the very unlikely chance that Florida State does lose their case to the ACC and they are stuck in the conference, and you don't want to be on the wrong side of history if you are in those discussions. So I think there's a certain level of Miami and North Carolina and everyone else really just kind of waiting it out, waiting to see where the winds are shifting type of thing, and then jump in. And Clemson obviously feels confident enough in Florida State's case against the ACC, or just feel confident enough that they need to do something as well, that they have jumped into the fire, and now it looks like Miami and North Carolina could be very shortly behind. I saw Andy Staples was talking about on his show with Pete Nakos about all of this, and Miami and North Carolina have been interested in this for quite some time. Let's put it that way. They've been kind of watching this very, very closely, and with Clemson joining in, with Florida State not being the only school out there on its island, it's very possible that these two schools join in. And if Miami, I think, would be the more likely to join in immediately, partly because North Carolina is in the same state as the ACC headquarters, would create a little bit of a problem there. But if Miami jumps in, and especially North Carolina, because of that dynamic, the ACC will just be drowning in court cases. And that is something that the ACC has plenty of money. They're not necessarily hurting in the pocketbooks, but to be totally fair, there's only so much you can take. There's only so many, court filings. There's only so much money that can be poured into these cases before you kind of have to throw your hands up and say, okay, you guys won. And it would really, really stink to see that happen. But at the end of the day, it feels like we're on this kind of slippery slope where more and more ACC teams are seeing the conference as vulnerable, first of all, in these court cases, is seeing that the conference is not keeping up with the rest of the college football world, which is obviously a huge problem, and they see an opening. And the opening is essentially, if we don't take it now, where are we sitting in 5 years if we stay in the ACC? And I think that's a big question on everyone's mind, because Miami joins, North Carolina joins, maybe Virginia joins the fight. If all of those guys jump out of the conference, there are more behind them, I promise. Whether it's, Pittsburgh going to the Big 12, or Georgia Tech going to the Big 12 or the SEC, or a million different teams that North Carolina State could go to the Big 12. There are tons of teams that will find a new place to play football because, as we talked about earlier, you take out Miami, North Carolina, Clemson, Florida State, you take out a big reason that the ACC outpaced the Big 12 in the revenue distribution deals. You lose essentially all the legs to stand on in those discussions, and you become a group of five type conference that just has to take what is given to them and say thank you and move on. So it's obviously not what any of us want, but it could be the road that we're heading down, with more and more of these cases piling up and more of a financial burden being put on the ACC. And the question is now, what does the ACC do from here? And I think it's pretty much just damage control time. I think if there was always a chance that they were going to beat out Florida State and be able to work something out to where maybe only Florida State leaves, or maybe they only lose a couple of guys up top, or maybe they could work something out where they could stay afloat. But with more and more people joining the fray, Clemson now, I think UNC and Miami are likely not short behind, but we'll see what happens there. It's going to be really hard to stay viable as a big-time conference, and you're probably going to have to backfill a little bit if you want to stay a conference. So that means going into the American and getting some teams. That means going into the Sun Belt, especially, I think, whether it's Troy or App State. Going into Conference USA, you can snag some teams from there. So there are some options out there. It's obviously not ideal. It's not the same situation the Big 12 was in, where they could backload from the Pac-12, but you can do something. You can add Oregon State and Washington State back into the fray. You can do a number of things, but right now it looks like we are down a road that essentially we cannot come back from at this point. It sounds like the ACC days are numbered, and at least as we know it today, and hopefully they can figure out a good plan quickly, because I think teams are leaving. I think they're leaving pretty quickly, and you're going to need some options coming in the back door. So we'll figure out what all of that means going forward. We'll definitely get updates on this court case, and we'll get updates on some more, I'm sure, pretty soon. So keep up to date with all of that type of stuff. It is going to be a crazy ride. So we will have, I'm sure, a number of segments throughout or the end of this week into next week about all of this stuff and the fallout. But for now, we're going to take our first break, and when we come back, we're going to get into some spring questions. Spring football is starting all over the country. There are tons of teams to watch, tons of narratives to watch across the country as well, so we will get to that right after this break, so stick with us.